Hi, friends. Peter Bonilla, Executive Director of the MIT Free Speech Alliance here. We're going to get going with Bernard in just another minute or two. But I want to thank everyone for tuning into the webinar this afternoon. Also, a quick apology from me. I didn't realize when I had queued up the settings for this webinar that it wanted me to manually approve guests. So a lot of you only got your emails just in the last handful of minutes. I've never once told Zoom that's how I wanted to do things, and it decided this time that's how I wanted to do things. So thanks for bearing with me. I hope it didn't keep anyone out of the discussion, but very happy to have you all here. And we're going to get going in just a moment. I've got plenty of ground to cover with our guest Bernard Schweitzer today, but the Q&A and the chat should be open. So anyone who has any questions coming up in the course of the discussion, feel free to drop them in the Q&A, and I will do my best to get to them with our guests. But in the meantime, Bernard, I think I'm going to start things off. So thanks everyone for coming to this Dog Days edition of our
Well,
MIT Free Speech Alliance summer sessions. Again, I'm Peter Bonilla. I am the executive director of the MIT Free Speech Alliance, and I'm very happy to have Bernard Schweitzer, the director of Heresy Press, with us today. Bernard is a retired professor of English at Long Island University, Brooklyn, who earned his doctorate from Duke University. And rather than use his third act to relax, travel, take up some hobbies, maybe some light crafts, Bernard decided to found a new publishing house, which in the 2020s can seem like the ultimate triumph of hope over experience, although, having talked with a number of people involved with the press, gotten to know a number of its titles, it is filling a very important niche for the publishing community and one that we maybe didn't need 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. So I'm really excited to have Bernard Schweitzer with us today. Bernard, welcome to the MIT Free Speech Alliance.
thanks, Peter, and thanks for having me. And hello, everybody.
Bernard, we'll get into the business and the economics and the politics and culture of the publishing industry soon enough. But I want to talk first about your background before you got to the press, because a quick look at your CV, shows a wide-ranging interest in various kinds of provocative and transgressive writers. Among your writing and editing work have been volumes on Christianity and humor and Muslims and humor. Um, and there's a long history in your career of kind of pulling at that thread and seeing where it goes, literary wise. And I would just love for you to give our guests a little bit more of your background, which seems like it set you up quite well to launch Heresy Press when the time came.
Yes, I've had a lifelong fascination with misfits and nonconformists and rebels. And they really find a great haven in literature. Literature is full of them. But the writers themselves often are nonconformists and rebels, outsiders sometimes. And I was drawn to them for reasons that I'm not entirely sure myself, other than I can say my education maybe has primed me for this a little bit. So I grew up in Switzerland and I attended the Waldorf school there for all of my my formative years and my basic education, which is grades 1 through 9. And I attended the Waldorf school, and they don't follow a systematic curriculum. It's pretty organic. They emphasize the whole child philosophy of teaching, crafts, and active hands-on things, and going outside to the woods, and then a little bit of of math and some history thrown in. It's all chaotic and unsystematic. And when I graduated from ninth grade, I had huge gaps and holes that I had to fill through self-study. But one thing it did is, I guess it left me with this kind of maybe just basic curiosity and not a very systematic mindset in a way. So I wasn't really, I wasn't focused in on this very academic STEM or otherwise systematized form of education. So that's why I was always attracted by loners and idiosyncratic individuals. So when I finally went to my research path in literary studies, I focused on one of these outsiders and sort of made my career in a sense by studying Rebecca West, not so incredibly well-known writer today, but she was very influential in the 20th century. She is an absolute idiosyncratic person with an eclectic mix of skills, and you can't classify her. That's the thing, the lack of classification. That was my basic education. Waldorf School doesn't classify, it throws everything open and encourages these organic connections between themes and ideas and personalities. And so, yeah, I studied her. I tried to, I guess, ironically, I tried to bring some system to Rebecca West's oeuvre, her work. And so that just was an endless source of fascination for me to find somebody who had this free spirit and free roaming and non-systematic also kind of background. These people fascinate me. Other rebels I can think of that I studied intensely include Zora Neale Hurston. I mean, she was an amazing literary and social rebel. She rebelled against God as well in her work. Or George Orwell, he was despised by the left, by the right for his independent thinking stance. So these people just fascinate me. And so then I took this interest and I started to pursue people who are religiously rebellious, who I'm calling misotheists, who are still believers, but who cannot worship God, but rather hate God, or have an aversion to God. And that expresses itself in very interesting ways in literature as well. So whole literary works and even oeuvres are made up of this kind of impulse to protest and rebel against God. Then comes humor and religion as a next, kind of phase in this development. Humor, of course, always being a kind of a disruptive force, if you will, right? It's incongruous. It enjoys incongruity and disruption and also edginess and yeah, some offensiveness as well occasionally. So they test the boundaries. Humor tests those boundaries again, and the people who are the best humorists are the ones who live at this kind of trickster. They live this kind of trickster life existence at the boundaries. So here it is. Maybe it makes sense, but that's kind of the landscape I operate in.
Okay, so let's fast forward a bit to now you're retired from teaching. You're surveying the publishing landscape. In the late 2010s into the early 2020s, there were social and political upheavals affecting just about every kind of major civilian institution. The nonprofit world, journalism, universities, publishing was definitely one of them. I think as you said, your first real big bit of national exposure for the press was from a retrospective in the New York Times that Pamela Paul did on the legacy of the controversy over American Dirt, the novel, and the fallout that had. I wonder if you could walk us through the thought processes that led to you making the decision. Okay, it's the time is now to put my name on this new publishing house, to give a new to give a home to these kinds of writers that maybe once were welcomed at publishing houses with relatively open arms, but who now just don't have a place to ply their trade. I'd love to hear what went into the process of making that decision to found Heresy Press.
Yeah, so it was a very personal trajectory and story. It really started with me writing a novel, and like so many other people, bored out of their wits during COVID. We were under lockdown, there were social distancing protocols, travel restrictions for many months, for over a year. So I hunkered down and I started to write the novel that was in the back of my mind, rumoring around, and I was just giving it shape finally, sitting down. And I ended up writing 140,000 word opus, a novel that really, a story that consumed me, and that I then obsessively, polished and revised and edited and then sent out to friends and colleagues whose judgment I trusted, and came back with really good notes. They thought it was a marvelous story. And hopefully, as I started to submit it to literary agents and to presses, thinking, there's something, I have something very unusual. Again, something, offbeat and definitely unconventional, nonconformist. And I assumed naturally that this is what literary agents and editors, the so-called gatekeepers, are looking for. They want something unusual. I mean, my story included a female Muslim apostate, so a woman who left the Muslim faith, and her conflicts with her parents because of that. A criminal Buddhist guru, and a bunch of sovereign citizens. Those are the people at the far, far right end of the spectrum. They reject any state authority, and they're real. It's a real movement in the United States. In some places, they drive around without driver's license. They fabricate their own license plates and so on. They pretend that they are not under the jurisdiction of the United States. So I threw those in. It's like, chemical agents, strong chemical agents that I threw in a test tube. And I wanted to see the reaction, what happens when you throw those elements into the test tube. And it was fascinating what happened. The story I thought it was really interesting and great, but I just gained no traction whatsoever. And just deafening silence or standard rejection letters. I ended up writing to 170 literary agents and about 40 presses, over 200 letters, And then I happened to talk to a person who's connected to the publishing industry one day, and he said, well, Bernard, looking at your story, it's quite perverse what you did. You wrote the perfect recipe for rejection. Nobody is going to take that story. I said, well, it's well written, it's well paced, it is interesting. Why would nobody look at that? It's because of these themes, the themes that now are off limits, that are taboo. So many themes. If you have any character, even if you're not personally critical of Islam, but if you have a character who is, that's it. That's the end of it, right? Sovereign citizens, you're making fun of those. You're treating them as kind of buffoons in a satirical way. But okay, they're right-wing people. You're not supposed to have them in the story. And so I realized after a while that there were all these, limitations and restrictions on a thematic level that the gatekeepers, the literary gatekeepers, maintained. And that's not just words that are taboo. So if you remember, there was this big kerfuffle in 2023 around Roald Dahl's books, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and other books, where editors went over his entire work and they excised words like ugly and fat and crazy. And they even replaced words like man and woman with people. And so that's a form of cultural vandalism for me, but that's what was actually happening. And that is straightforward censorship, right? That is censorship. And so then there's add to that, the taboo words, you add the taboo topics. And to get a sense of that, to be very specific, right? I can't be specific. If you look at what agents want, their wish list, but they also usually, when you look at their website, there are anti-wish lists, what they absolutely don't want. So I give a few examples from that. So here's an agent who says, I don't want stories about a specific marginalized identity or experience written by authors who don't share that identity. So in order to write about a certain struggle of a certain character, you have to have the same racial and ethnic background as that character. It's presumed that a person from another background cannot have the kind of empathy or imaginative reach to construct that struggle without being it themselves, right?
And this isn't something that agents were asking 20 years ago.
It isn't. No. For instance, this is really a result of course, kind of social justice thinking, of certainly identity politics, where the individual is treated as a representative of the whole group and no longer as an individual. So it is really that, but also a sense of safetyism has crept into literature, where literature is no longer allowed to be challenging or unsettling or offending to some people who maybe wish to take offense rather than are given offense. So an example of this safetyism comes from the same list of one of those agents. Stories, she doesn't want stories that portray hate crimes, sexual violence, or domestic violence on the page. Wait a minute, which really, compelling novel that we remember, whether it's Crime and Punishment or another, or Lolita, or some other novel that is, maybe difficult, challenging, unsettling at times, but doesn't have some kind of domestic violence or sexual violence in it. Or let me give you another example here. Anything involving incest, including, well, okay, that.
Oh, Bernard, is it possible that you cut out a moment ago?
I'm reminded of what agents, foreign rights agents told me, who are trying to sell narratives, who's trying to sell Heresy Press books to, let's say, Russia or China.
Hey, Bernard, I'm going to cut in for just a moment. I
Yeah.
think for some of us, myself included, Zoom kind of froze up on us, and we probably lost maybe the last 30 seconds to a minute of what you were talking
Okay.
about. Would you mind just going back a few steps and
Sure.
catching us up?
Sure. No problem. So when the literary agents post on their websites that they don't want to read anything involving incest or anything involving featuring drugs and or addiction as a central or supplemental plot points, that reminds me of the restrictions I heard from foreign rights agents who are considering Heresy Press stories but want to sell them to, let's say, Russia or China. Nations where there's state censorship in place, but where you can still buy fiction and you can still buy some foreign translated books, but they cannot involve any obvious and prominently displayed drug use or drug consumption and abuse. There cannot be very explicit sex scenes, for instance. There cannot.
Oh,
All right.
Oh, Bernard, I think we lost you again for another little spell, maybe another 30 seconds.
That's okay. So I should have fairly strong Wi-Fi here, but let's hope that no more interruptions happen. It shouldn't be my end. I hope not, at least. Yeah.
And I don't think it should be mine because I'm in my downtown office with its gold-plated internet. So we'll see.
Maybe the powers that be and the gods are trying to interrupt Heresy Press's mission somehow.
Well, I mean,
Outreach.
you never know.
So anyway, the long and short of it is that the kinds of catalogs of what you cannot publish anymore in the United States, because these are not just individual one or two or three or a handful of catalogs. This percolates throughout the industry. This is really representative that there's a long list of things you can no longer do, whereas art in general, literature in particular, of course, is all about transgressiveness, about experimentalism, about boundary pushing, right? About just forging ahead with new ideas. And great literature sometimes makes people perhaps a little bit uncomfortable or gives them a punch in the face. Or like, as Franz Kafka said, that's why we have this book titled Axe, because of his saying, an axe must be the book it must be like a book we take to the frozen sea within us. It needs to break up those kind of frozen structures that are within us. And in order for a book to accomplish that, it does some kind of mini violence to us sometimes, right? It can be unsettling and maybe even upsetting. But, as we expect, so Heresy Press is expecting resilient and mature readers and not fragile creatures who have to be protected. So this kind of safetyism that has crept into the literary publishing industry is I think, goes counter to the whole ethos and the spirit of what literature is about. And so, to go back to the journey that I just realized that the publishing industry needs some kind of alternative to all of this. It needs, this orthodoxy needs to be broken up, and they're broken up. There needs to be some kind of publisher that is an alternative who considers the submissions and looks first and foremost at the literary merit and at the originality of ideas and the aesthetic appeal, rather than immediately focusing on the content. Because the danger of that is you then also tend to accept, if you just consider only the content of what you're getting, these agents and editors, they may accept works that the content, is appealing to them, but it's just not a work of art. It's not on the level of style or aesthetics. The craft of writing is just lacking. And I have a suspicion that many of today's gatekeepers they don't have the skills to assess formal qualities of writing, the style, like I said, the aesthetic, craft aspect.
Yep.
And so
sorry, I was going to back things up for just a moment. To the talk of gatekeepers and your experience trying to sell your one novel, I wonder, because I've put in some time, not in the literary world, but I worked in theater for a time before I went into civil liberties. I was a literary manager. I was a kind of gatekeeper. In the sense of, I did a lot of script reading. I did script development. I helped my company decide what new things got put into production, what got into development, what we might throw a little bit of money at. And I'm curious to know, in your efforts, did you talk to other writers who were having the same problem? Is this something that, as you got deeper into the scene, you encountered more of, and you got a sense that this was a kind of systematic problem? Because I've I've been a gatekeeper to writers and I've done some writing
Yep.
myself. And there's always the wonder in the back of, there's always the wonder in the back of your mind was like, sometimes it'd be easier just to tell me if my work is no damn good and I can move on.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I
Exactly.
wonder, like, I wonder, how you got the sense of this is kind of a bigger thing than just than you and your own work. Oh, and I've triggered the.
Okay.
There we
Great
go.
question.
You
Great
cut
question.
for about 10 seconds there, but I don't think we lost anything of substance. When I put this on the YouTube, I'll edit these bits out, and I thank our friends for bearing with us. But yeah, if you could talk
Yep.
about just kind of how you came to how you came to the understanding that this is a more systematic thing than just
Yeah.
one man's efforts to get a novel through a process that used to work at least a little bit more in his favor. I'd love to hear
Yeah.
that.
So at first, of course, I talk with other fellow writers personally, people I knew who are maybe also in the market with their writing and they experienced similar struggles as I did. But then, as soon as I opened Heresy Press and opened for submissions, that's when I heard dozens and dozens and dozens of accounts of exactly this with quotes from literary agents and editors of why they rejected manuscripts. There is a place on the Heresy Press website, I think, where I have a bunch of these quotes. And there was a time I collected them and I got up to several dozens of statements from literary gatekeepers just flatly rejecting um, submissions, flatly rejecting short stories or novels based solely on their um, thematic direction or certainly on the basis of the identity of the author as compared to the cast of characters. So the whole, own voices movement, which started in about 2016, which became a kind of also a industry-wide orthodoxy, according to which the author can only write characters that are pretty much closely matching his or her own identity background. So if you're a white author, you're not allowed to write black characters. And that's been the reason for rejecting a rainbow. It has a whole mix of characters from different race and ethnicity and backgrounds. It's extremely well done. It's extremely compassionately and insightfully done. And it's a wonderful story. I mean, it got rave reviews from several different review outlets, and um, it was rejected. And so likewise, many, many, many other authors, even those that I then also rejected. Not everybody who comes to me with a sob story about how they had been rejected because of identity politics, because of the own voice. Not all of those are then accepted by Heresy Press for publication. So the threshold is very high. I only publish 6 books per year, and about half of them are fiction. So, it just the mathematics are really daunting for authors because by now I have received over 300 fiction submissions and I have published probably a dozen novels. So, the acceptance rate is very low. But I do take anything that's absolutely stellar, that is just really a work of art and is absolutely brilliantly conceived regardless of all those those shibboleths, whether it's own voices or not, or whether it has a taboo word in it, or whether it has a taboo topic in it or not. I just judge works by their inherent literary merit. and their quality. And so that's why Heresy Press was founded in the first place in 2023. And the official story is here that I felt the need that the publishing world needs to have an alternative outlet for these voices that are sidelined. The unofficial story is that I just complained in private too much until my dear wife just lost her patience, and she said, "Okay, Bernard, stop complaining. Do something about it. Found your own press or whatever, but stop complaining about the state of affairs," right? So I said, "Okay, let me try." It's not easy, I have to say. Publishing is a very tough business, and we can get into the economics at some point during our talk as well. But it's definitely been the most rewarding thing I think I've done in my life so far. More rewarding than even teaching, because I really feel I'm responding to an absolute need. And I just get to pick these wonderful works of art, and now increasingly also nonfiction books that cover subjects that are otherwise just not covered.
Bernard, I've had a question come in from one of our attendees that I thought I'd put your way because we've been on kind of this topic. And he asks, in selecting what you'd accept for publishing, how would you separate rejection due to quote unquote forbidden topics versus rejection for just bad writing? This is a line that once I had to know how to stay on the right side of in my prior life as a literary manager, which I think for a lot of the same reasons it's not as fun to be in publishing now. It's a lot less fun to be a literary manager because I imagine in theater you have a lot of these same landmines and a lot of these same kind of fault lines and no-go zones that have crept into the publishing world. But when you are when you are founded on the principles of unfettered inquiry, a rejection of this kind of safetyism, of this kind of the need for own voices, essentialism, how do you how do you do that job while also trying to be a marker of excellence in what you do publish?
So the threshold, the bar is really very high at Heresy Press, because not only in order for me to publish something, not only does it have to be heterodox to some degree, or filling a gap that mainstream suppresses. So in other words, I do look for something a bit heretical, as in the name of Heresy Press. It has to be timely and relevant, and it has to be very, very, very well written. And here I step in directly and I edit. I do developmental editing, I do story doctoring and things like that. So I do all of that with the authors that I think they have something, but they're just not quite there yet. But on top of all of that, the book, before I can bring it out, has to have a viable, sizable audience. And of course, how do you know that? So sometimes it's guesswork, but I make my publishing decisions together with the president of Skyhorse Publishing, Tony Lyons. So I'm an imprint of Skyhorse. So they shoulder, the financial risk of financing the entire production and the print runs and all of that and the publicity. I bring them the books under my brand of Heresy Press, but he shoulders the financial risk. And so we make the decisions together as co-publishers of these titles. And sometimes he just, convinces me that we would lose too much money on such and such a title, even though it may be a valid topic. But it has a niche audience of 100 people, right? Or a valid novel, but that's just too niche. So that's something I wish I didn't have to consider commercial aspects as well, but I have to, because it's a business at the end of the day, and it's a commonly known industry kind of insider knowledge that more than 90% of all the books that are published in the United States sell fewer than 1,000 copies. Now, it takes 1,000 copies for me to break even. Okay. And that's also, I've asked around, this is pretty much a standard, unless you produce books so cheaply that you can tell, right? They look cheap. But if you produce a decent hardcover book, you need to sell 1,000 copies before you break even. And so that's an element that also factors in. And that's something that writers sometimes just don't understand. That, okay, I really liked their work and I pitched it because I was passionate about it. I pitched it to my boss, to Tony, and he just said, I cannot sell enough of this. And then, with a bleeding heart, I have to let go some projects. We still pass, I would say, about 2/3 of the projects that, I've whittled down through the different stages of the admissions process, from long list to short list to ultra short list. And then I pitch that to Tony, and we pass about 2/3 of those, but we cannot pass all of them. So yeah, and how do I judge these works on the aesthetic standards? Well, it's my métier, right? It's my job for the last few decades that I've been trained in literary studies. And I've taught thousands of novels in graduate school and college levels. And yeah, I do have a background that I feel like quite confident judging the literary quality of those submissions. And submissions are the lifeblood. So I don't call it slush pile. I call it the lifeblood. That's right. We all survive because we get work submitted to us from writers who are hopeful.
When I was literary manager, a good first sign for a script was the simple fact of, did I read it all the way to the end? If I did, that playwright was already in fairly select company. And in my experience, I was working for a company whose interests were very niche. It was a very contemporary, kind of politically and socially themed company. So most of what came in got rejected just for being outside of our narrow lane. And when you have so many to read, you kind of you'll eliminate something on a technicality if it lets you get on with the rest of your day and get on to the next thing in the file. But if I made it all the way to the end, it was like, oh, this person might be pretty good, and I might want to keep an eye on this person. But yeah, it's maybe not quite the same. Maybe not quite the same benchmark for judging excellence, but it was something I had to develop a kind of instinct for. We talk about, we were just talking about the economics of what it takes to break even in Heresy's world. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about the fortunes of the industry on the whole. I have a sense that, there's been a lot of consolidation. There has been, in a lot of areas, there's been kind of cost cutting. You kind of like, you can pick up a newly published paperback now and feel where the money has been cut. In the binding and the pulping, even in the ink. It's like, why is this hard to read? Why am I squinting just to look at the page? So you can see, you can kind of see and sometimes touch the changing fortunes of the industry. And I know it's not easy to be a small press. It's not easy to be a brick and mortar bookstore. But I wonder if you can kind of put your challenges in the context of the industry's challenges on the whole. And I wonder if you see the economic challenges as part of the problem for why there is less of that kind of literary risk taking.
Yeah, sure. Those factors are all linked together. So the biggest upheaval, if you will, in the literary publishing landscape in the last about 30 years has been simply the explosion of numbers of titles that are published per year. That leads then to an ever shrinking slice of the pie per book. So if in 1990 you had fewer than 50,000 titles published in the United States in the entire year. In 2010, there were about 300,000 titles, already manyfold more. But 300,000 titles were published in 2010. Go fast forward to 2025. Guess how many titles were published in 2025?
I'll say 1 million.
Times 4. 4 million. So the vast majority of those titles are self-published and they never have any market penetration. So the rule of thumb is that 90% of the self-published books are vanity projects. They go to friends and family, and that's about it. They end up on a shelf, but they don't have market penetration. But 10% do, which out of about 3.3 million self-published books is still 350,000 roughly. Add to that the 650,000 traditionally published books. So we went from 2010, 300,000 traditionally published to 650,000 traditionally published titles. 350, you get 1 million of different individual titles published in 1 year. So that's a 20-fold increase since 1990. That means, the winners, those that end up on the New York Times bestseller list, that still sell a few 10,000 of copies. They're all promoted by the big five. They're all part of that ecosystem. The rest, the crumbs, so to speak, from that pie, everybody squabbles after that among the micro and small and independent presses. So the size of the slice of that pie per book gets ever smaller. And that also means, authors' advances is one of those things. Can an author live nowadays off of being an author? I don't think so. None of my Heresy Press authors is a professional author, but they have jobs. They have daytime jobs. They write on the side. Because nowadays, if you get $1,500 as an advance, that's normal, right? For a debut author, or even a second time or third time author, maybe $2,000 or so. It used to be $6,000, $7,000, $8,000. So that has changed, certainly. The numbers of the print runs have come down. Like I said, over 90% of books nowadays sell fewer than 1,000 copies. So
yeah, and some I've noticed, this was something I always took for granted. Some publishers are, even after something comes out in hardcover, you assume, okay, in 6 months to a year, I'll catch it in paperback, and a lot of publishers don't even do that anymore. If something doesn't move enough hardcover units.
Exactly.
I wonder. So we've had this explosion in self-publishing and very small kind of indie titles that make up for a lot of that glut in publishing. But if we keep things to, say, the big five, in terms of the volume of output, they're the ones that they're the ones that get they get the table space at the Barnes and Noble when you go in the entrance. The ones that they capture most of the attention. Has their output remained steady? Has it declined? Do you have a sense of how they compare to the rest of the industry?
What I know is that the number of books sold per year in total hasn't changed much. Interestingly, it hovers between 700 to 800 million books a year in the United States. So that hasn't changed all that much. But more and more of the bestseller share goes to those big five publishers. And they, in turn, as well as the small publishers, because they want to have a little bit of that remaining pie, they tend to channel their interests toward what is still selling well: romantasy,
yes,
mystery thriller, fantasy. Those genres get pushed because at least there is a chance of making your money back. But so that's not a good pressure. You don't want that kind of pressure, because what we also need is historical fiction. We need satires.
Mhm.
We need different kinds of books that are not in those kind of more bestseller rank um, genres. So Heresy Press, we are not um, chasing the dollars in that sense. So if financial gain were our objective, I would have long ago stopped doing this. So Heresy Press really lives by its mission of free, open, and unfettered publishing.
Sure.
Um, and so, yeah, it's hard to make money, but it's also hard on the authors as well. So that's something also to keep in mind.
Sure. I've had a really good question come in.
Yeah.
And that is, what is the value proposition for an author who is considering putting out a title independently? Because it's easier, it's easier than ever to do that now. And you see the occasional story. I think Theo of Golden is one of one that was initially published
Yeah.
independently and absolutely took off.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's the one that's
Yeah.
on everyone's bedroom wall if you're a
Yeah.
self-published author. But
Yeah.
with it being easier and cheaper than ever uh to do that, what's the value added of working with a press like Heresy on putting out a title?
Well, it's certainly number one value added is distribution. So when you desktop publish your novel and you self-publish it, you essentially have zero distribution other than what you do with your own shoe leather. You go from door to door, or you go to literary conferences, or you have a table at a literary festival, and you push those books to friends and family. That's about your distribution. You can go to bookstores personally, or you can make a contract with one of the distributors that is open to self-publishing authors. That costs quite a lot. With Heresy Press,
Well, may have lost Bernard for a moment. Give him see if he comes back.
through the Heresy Press channels.
Oh, Bernard, you froze up for just another moment there. Would you mind backtracking
Sure, no
just a bit?
problem. Yeah, like I said, so distribution, nationwide distribution is a big plus. That's just part of when we sign on an author, they get distribution. Their book gets distributed through Simon and Schuster. But not only that, I go around to international book festivals like the Frankfurt Book Fair, and I pitch those books to agents and to presses from around the world. So currently, Heresy Press is distributed in Brazil, in Ireland, in UK, in Czech Republic, and in Turkey, and it will be in other nations next year in addition to that. So a small press that has that kind of international footprint is unusual. It's just because of my initiative and, really also, again, shoe leather, right? You're going actually physically to those conferences and book fairs, and you go from booth to booth, you talk to agents, you talk to presses, and you do find interest and distribution worldwide. So those are things that most self-published authors really can't do. And then, I have, of course, the Heresy Press mailing list, right? We have a network. We have a fan community, if you will, people who will pretty much buy every novel that comes out. And that is growing. So I have the newsletter, which alerts people to, and that finds pretty good distribution because I always spice up the newsletter, not just with the dry news, but with an essay or a short story, or some other content that makes it more palatable and interesting. So yeah, there's just different layers of publicity and marketing that are happening that otherwise wouldn't quite. But then again, we are not, Random House, Penguin Random House. We are not Macmillan. We are not Simon & Schuster itself, which is one of the big five. And so we don't quite have the marketing muscle of those, but we do, we do get the word out. At least that is for sure.
In terms of, in terms of the, I hear everything you're saying, and but I wonder also. I'm curious to know. I don't talk to very many publishing executives. What percentage of your sales are print versus electronic? Because at least with a a book that you publish through Amazon's storefront, well, you may not have any distribution. You may have to go out and do it all yourself, but the experience is pretty frictionless. My Kindle has hundreds of books on it because I keep, one of the first thing I do is go to the Kindle store every morning and see what's been discounted to $1.99, which is an irresistible price to me. So how do you compete on that level when, granted, it's hard to, it's hard to get your foot in the door when you're self-publishing, but you can give people that frictionless experience if you get out there and promote it enough. So I'm curious to hear how how ebooks factor into your overall economics.
Well, I don't set the prices myself for Heresy Press books. That's
That's
my parent
Skyhorse's
company,
job.
Skyhorse, that sets the prices. And for some reason, they don't favor the 99 cents or $1.99 ebooks. They actually price them, lower than the print book, but still $12.99, for instance,
Sure.
for the hardcover. And they have their own financial, economic reasons for that. But definitely print is the leader by far still for Heresy Press books, for Skyhorse books. And of course, there are some publishers that may achieve a majority of sales through ebooks and maybe even audiobooks as well. But the average is still 70-20-10. 70% print books, 20% ebooks, 10% audiobooks. Although audiobooks have the greatest growth, are the greatest growth sector right now. So they grow faster than the other mediums, but they still only make up for an average of 10% of the sales. So hopefully that will grow. And most of the Heresy Press books do have all three media. So we do have audiobooks as well as ebooks and print books. But yeah, it's not a very big factor. I'm surprised myself when I look at those royalty statements and I see, okay, the print books are definitely still by far the majority of sales figures. That may change over time. It changes more in some markets than others. In China, the move towards ebook reading on mobile devices is faster. And so there, the increase in ebook sales is bigger than in some other markets. But in the United States, it's been fairly flat as far as I know. Yeah.
Okay. We're suddenly, I knew this would happen. I knew this conversation would move right along. But I'd like to talk a little bit about your forays into nonfiction. I've got a couple of the titles that you've put out, both of which I recommend. There's The War on Words by Greg Lukianoff and Nadine Strossen. My background is kind of cutting it out, but there it is. And then your most recent volume, which you co-edited with John Tomasi, Heterodox Academy's president,
Yeah.
Viewpoint Diversity, what it is, why we need it, and how to get it. Which, if you're on this call and you're planning on coming to our conference in September, we will have a few dozen copies of these to give away in case you needed the incentive. But you got into this game as as primarily a publisher of fiction, but you've worked with FIRE and you've worked with Heterodox Academy to put these volumes out in the last year or so. And I'm just curious to hear, how, like, there's a very there's a real logic to working with those types of organizations, organizations that protect dissent and promote, heterodox thinking. But I'm curious, just for your thoughts on how your nonfiction role is evolving and how you see these kinds of partnerships as fulfilling your larger overall mission.
Yeah, I mean, thematically, clearly, these two books are manifestations of our mission. That's what we stand for. Free speech and unfettered expression in the widest sense, as well as a diversity of viewpoints. And by the way, the Viewpoint Diversity book, that is the first on its topic, if you can believe that. There is a slew of books on diversity, equity, and inclusion, but there was not a single book on viewpoint diversity, on intellectual and ideological idea viewpoint diversity. So I said to myself, okay, well, it expresses our mission perfectly. And it is at the same time, there's a gap. There's one of those things that mainstream publishing just wasn't interested in. They didn't want to promote this for reasons that, viewpoint diversity has been made to look bad or, acquired a bad name, because anything you can put the word weaponize in front of then becomes bad. Weaponized free speech is bad, weaponized viewpoint diversity, whereas viewpoint diversity in itself is one of the key and foundational principles of free democratic society. So it's a good thing. And it should be discussed, from multiple perspectives, as we did in this book. And so, yeah, it was very satisfying to be able to bring together all those contributors. And we have about 20 different contributors who thought this was a worthy undertaking. And lo and behold, those two books are our two best sellers, right? So I realized that nonfiction sells more copies than fiction. So I cannot just be a fiction outfit as much as I kind of originally, like you said, that was the impetus, right? Let's give a home to really free and unfettered and diverse and challenging and heterodox fiction. Let's give them a home. But then I realized, okay, there are nonfiction books too that may not really find a home other than Heresy Press. And they do sell. They're easier to sell. They're easier to scale, especially when you can partner with organizations like Heterodox Academy and FIRE. Of course, that's a great bonus. So yeah, I will definitely continue. I have 3 more nonfiction books in the pipeline. I just released the Heresy Press newsletter a few days ago, and in there I discussed 2 forthcoming nonfiction books. One will come out just before the midterm elections, called Culture of Confusion. And that also is a book that nobody else would touch in the publishing industry, because it looks at militant political violence on the left as well as the right. It doesn't start from the premise that political violence is mainly a problem on the left. It's mainly a problem on the right. No, it starts from the premise that there is a problem on both sides, and let's look at it very closely. And what is behind it? What are the dynamics of these riots that we have seen since 2020, and how do they also play out in terms of national elections? So a very relevant, ultra timely topic.
Mm.
I
Oh,
okay. Yep.
there we go.
There we are
We lost you one. They had to stick it to you one last time.
to stick it to me.
Well, we're at about the top of the hour. I want to be respectful of all our friends' time. I thank everyone. I thank everyone for joining in here. Again, like I said, we'll have copies of the Viewpoint Diversity volume on hand if you come to our conference. But Bernard, before we go, I want to, make sure you're able to boost some of the new products that you're excited about. You talked a little bit about Acts, the short story volume that you put out, which I'm excited to read, and which I see you edited alongside Adam Satella, who I had on this webinar a couple of months ago, and whose book is Dangerous from MIT Press. I super highly recommend. It got into some of these same issues that we've been discussing here this afternoon. But before we go, anything else that you're excited to tell us about in terms of what's hit recently and what else you've got coming up?
Yeah, so Axe really is just an amazing book that I hope people will discover for themselves just what a powerhouse of short story.
Oh, Bernard, not now. I really hope this isn't my connection. I really hope this hasn't been me the whole time. Talk amongst yourselves.
Yeah,
There we go. You're back.
just wanted to add to that. I am organizing a reading of Axe authors in New York City. So not in Boston, but so this a good number of contributors, including Joyce Carol Oates and Lionel Shriver and Jonathan Sandlofer and others, will participate in a reading on September 15 in downtown New York City. Yes. So details, of course, will be made available and through the newsletter and the Heresy Press mailing list.
Great.
That will be a very excited event in a bit under a month, September 15 in the evening. And the Regent, New York Gallery and Social Club on East Broadway in downtown Manhattan. So that will be a big event that Heresy Press is hosting. And then, the Culture of Confusion will come out about 10 days before the midterm elections. Maybe we'll have a little impact or not, but it will certainly
a little
be
October surprise, as they call it.
I don't think it will tip the scales, but who knows? And and then we go on from there. There are 5 other fantastic books, including another book about campus free speech and censorship sponsored by FIRE that is coming.
Hey.
Yep.
Hey, great. Oh, I can't wait to see more about that title.
Yep.
Well, all right. Well, Bernard, thanks so much from the MIT Free Speech Alliance for joining us this afternoon. I really enjoyed the discussion. As I knew it would, the hour flew right by. There's no shortage of material in today's publishing world to talk about. So thanks very much for giving us your time this afternoon. I look forward to doing more business together and to sharing more of your books with our conference attendees when they're here in Cambridge in September. So thanks very much, Bernard, and I hope we'll do this again sometime.
Thank you, Peter. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. And thanks,
Have a great
everybody.
day. And thanks everyone else for coming, and thanks for putting up with the occasional technical glitches.